Well, great to see all of you. Thank you so much for joining. This is a production of the IFA Franchisor Forum in partnership with the IFA Supplier Forum and the IFA Franchisee Forum. We love to collaborate on all kinds of projects, and we have some important topics today. We have some great guests with us. We really appreciate you joining. We are recording this session. We know some folks may be joining on a recorded basis, and we want to make sure they had access to this webinar content, and it is only for IFA members. So we appreciate all of you continuing to support IFA and the great work that the organization does for franchising. Next slide, please. So here is today's agenda, and so we have a lot to cover. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, and then we're going to start to get into some of the content. We're going to just do a brief welcome and level set on what the IFA Franchisor Forum is all about, with a invitation to engage with the IFA Franchisor Forum at all times. We will have some updates from our IFA government relations teammates, and specifically related to the FTC franchise rule, which we appreciate the great work they continue to do on behalf of franchisees, suppliers, and franchisors across the country. Then Daryl Johnson from Fran Data. Many of you probably know Daryl pretty well, just an expert in franchising, and he'll be talking to us about 2022 and beyond, taking an economic look at franchising. And this is a great time for that content as we're budgeting for 23 and we're doing strategic planning. This is a very relevant topic, and the timing is perfect. So we're really honored to have Daryl join us. Then we also have Aaron Covey to talk with us about another very timely topic. You may be aware that elections are coming up in just a few weeks, and so we're really happy to have Aaron here to give us an inside look at the midterm elections. Again, just coming up in a few weeks. Many of you may have already started voting. Then we'll have time for some Q&A. After each of those, actually, we'll have some time for Q&A. I will help facilitate some of the Q&A after Daryl's session, and then Sam Ballas, co-chair of the or vice chair of the Franchisor Forum, will facilitate some Q&A after Aaron's session. Then we'll talk about the next Franchisor Forum meeting coming up. Sam has some great content and strategic planning he's been doing for the Franchisor Forum, so he'll share a little bit about when that meeting is and what that meeting is going to be about, and then we'll have some closing remarks. And so with that, we do want to welcome you to the Franchisor Forum. So the Franchisor Forum is designed to encourage interaction amongst franchisor executives to better the franchising environment for franchisees, suppliers, and franchisors. We work closely with the IFA, Hayter, Catherine in particular, to develop content that is hopefully very helpful to franchisors in that mission. As I mentioned, Sam is the vice chair of the Franchisor Forum, and then Bethany Rippey on my team helps us amplify the messaging, and we really appreciate it very much. With that, let me hand it right over to Hayter, who has been a great teammate and continues to advocate for government relations for franchising. Hayter, take it away.
Thanks so much, Graham, and good to see so many of you on the line. I do apologize in advance for my deep voice here. I'm recovering from a sickness, but hopefully you don't have to listen to me too long. I did want to update you on a couple things as it relates to our federal issues. First and foremost, I do want to thank BNI Global for sponsoring this webinar, without whom this would not be possible for everyone outside the Franchisor Forum. So with that, as many of you know, the FTC franchise rule is up for its decennial review with the FTC. And I know many of you came to the annual fly-in in DC, and that was one of our major asks, was to go into these congressional offices and to ask for their support to sign on to a letter that will be sent to the FTC, essentially stating that the rule has been working great for the franchise community and should be reviewed and renewed. So to that end, we actually finalized the House letter last week, and it was sent in with 67 signatures. And of course, like I mentioned, this could not have been done without you. We had 14 Democrats and 53 Republicans on that letter. For some additional context, we sent a similar letter in 2019, which had, I think, around 18 signatories. So as you can imagine, we had almost plus 50 without, obviously, could not be done without your help. So we appreciate everyone coming to DC and advocating on behalf of the franchise community. That letter was sent in, like I said, last week. We still have a Senate letter out there and we hope to send that in next week. We are focused this week and early next week to basically following up with the offices that you met with, and also doing additional outreach to offices to see if they will sign on to the Senate letter. So what's next? After these 2 letters are sent, as you know, the FTC has still not indicated a timeline for the review process. We do anticipate that's going to come up in the next few weeks. So these 2 letters are very timely in that sense that we're sending these now. And when that time comes, I'm sure, we expect there'll be some proposed changes. What those changes will be like to the FTC franchise rule, we do not know. But we certainly think that these 2 letters are an important first step to basically essentially showcase the support for this franchise rule. So we'll keep everyone updated as the weeks and days go by. One thing that's not on here that I did want to update folks on is joint employer. As many of you know, the National Labor Relations Board issued an expansive proposed rule that would essentially expand the joint employer rule, where it's it's harmful in the sense that it not only it changes the definition to what constitutes as a joint employer, to the point where even if you have indirect, potential, or reserve control, you would be considered a joint employer. This is the worst rule that's ever been proposed. So IFA will be submitting comments. One thing I did want to mention is that the comment deadline was initially November 7th, but IFA, along with over 200 trade and business groups, sent a letter to ensure that comment deadline was extended. And it has been extended, and the new deadline is now December 7th. Just so you know, like I mentioned, IFA will submit their own comments, but we will also be sending you out an email soon in the coming days that will basically have a template of comments that you could submit on your own. So we encourage all the franchisors and the franchisees on the line and suppliers to submit those comments. So basically how that works is we'll send you an email with a template, and you can edit it as you see fit. And then you basically, with a click of a button, will send those comments in. So like I said, be on the lookout for that. We'll hopefully send that in the next few days, if not early next week. Next, brief update on California FAST Act. I think we have our colleague on the line with us, Jeff Hanscom. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hader. Hey, guys. Just a real quick update. I think everybody here already knows when the FAST Act was ultimately signed into law by Governor Newsom, we then immediately pivoted to a referendum effort. What that entails is basically collecting just shy of 1 million signatures from California registered voters, which would essentially pause implementation of the FAST Act for 2 full years until it could go on to the November 2024 ballot. We are about 5 or 6 weeks into that referendum effort right now, on a very good pace, over halfway there to our signature collection goal. So we should be on a trajectory to collect the requisite number of signatures that we need and get those submitted to the state, and ultimately pause implementation of 257. We will, like I said, we're over about 600,000 or so signatures, give or take. I get the official report actually every Tuesday evening, so I'll have it later tonight. But just a note that we're on a good path to get the signatures that we need. If folks are interested, we often get the question of how can we help, which we certainly appreciate. Right now, the primary mechanism for help is to help support financially the referendum effort, which is about a $21 million endeavor to collect the requisite number of signatures. You can see the savelocalrestaurants.com page there. There's a mechanism for you to donate to financially support the effort. If there are further questions on how you, your brands, your franchisees can engage or support, just let me know. Or like I said, if you have questions right now, happy to take them.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Well, that is our update on the government relations side. So back to you, Graham.
Certainly appreciate it, Hader, and Jeff, thanks for your hard work. For those that didn't catch that on the slide, just to give you a sense of the magnitude, the estimated incremental cost, if this FAST Act passes, is $150,000 per location. So just so you know, IFA is advocating for your interest, and you know, the changes at the state level and sometimes at the federal level can have serious impacts on your businesses. So just want to continue to encourage folks to stay very active with IFA and their government relations efforts. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Hader, for all the great work that you guys do. With that, I do want to hand it over to Daryl. He actually forbid me from formally introducing him. I will just let you know Daryl Johnson has a really impressive background. If you go to Fran Data's site, you can see his background, but he is the right person to be hearing from as we're thinking about the economy for the balance of the year and as we're thinking about the year ahead. And so I think one of his slides, I think his cover slide mentions that it's complicated. So Daryl will help us understand this, and we really appreciate him being here. So Daryl, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
I will, but I unfortunately just lost my screen. Hader, I'm going to ask you to run the slides because it literally just went away on me, and I rather than delay it, I think we should just keep moving. Okay.
No problem, Daryl.
All right. Thank you. It's planning season, and I am going to lay out some things that hopefully will give you a better set of assumptions to go into planning for next year and beyond. We always want to look at growth. Everybody got into franchising with the purpose of growing, but I think we're seeing some things here that may get you into a slightly different mindset as it relates to what to focus on in 2023 and well into perhaps even into 2024. The three things that I would want to touch on here. We'll touch briefly on the consumer side. What is driving the consumer behavior and the consumer spending that we have right now? I'm not going to restate some of the obvious, but I will highlight a couple of things that I think will help shape your planning ideas. Second, we can't grow without capital. The lending community there's a lot of change going on there. And as they face recessions, how do they behave? What do they do differently? Let's touch on that. And finally, we'll try and bring it back to what it means for franchising and what some of the base assumptions are that might be helpful for you to use as you go into the next year or so. I will note that some of the slides in the latter part of this are a bit busy. And rather than trying to have you run all through it, I'm sure we'll share the slides later. So I'm just going to highlight a few things on some of those slides, but there is a fair amount of information on a few of them, which I typically try and avoid. But I think for purposes of what we're dealing with in the coming year, I think it's helpful for you to see more, not less. The economy, everything we know about what's going on in the economy right now really comes down to three letters, FED. What the Fed does is going to dictate almost everything that goes on for the next 6 to 12 months in the economy. I would note that Chairman Powell is trying to do his best impersonation of Paul Volcker and actually do it better than what Paul Volcker did. And as we know, if those of us that lived through the 1980s, that was a pretty challenging time. If you can see on the graph, that first steep line, that's the rate, the pace with which we have experienced increased interest rates this year. Another one's coming next week. So it's a certainty that we're going to have a 75 basis point increase, and there may be one or more after that. If you look at the line that's associated with 1983, that increase that Paul Volcker did was over many more months. Here, we're driving this very quickly. Obviously, Chairman Powell thinks that in doing so, the Fed is hopeful that we will get a handle on inflation more quickly, and that will bring it down, and then they can take their foot off the gas. One of the factors to consider here is that from the time an interest rate changed by the Fed, which is their primary tool for fighting inflation, when they make that change, it takes anywhere from about 6 to 12 months to filter through the economy. They just started increasing rates in March. We're just beginning to see the impact of those initial rate changes, and yet we've had a bunch of them already, and we're going to have a couple more. Therefore, if you're looking at 2023, the large wave of impact from the Fed hasn't hit yet. And that's coming. It's going to find its way into rate changes for mortgages, for car loans, for credit cards, for business loans. all of those things, while they've been increasing over the last 6 months, they're not anywhere close to keeping pace to what the Fed is doing with the Fed funds rate changes. And so we're going to see more of this, and it's going to have its major impact yet to come. Touch on the labor market for the following reason. We already know where things stand, but the Fed is laser focused on one thing, and that's the unemployment rate. And it hasn't really budged yet. Part of the reason it hasn't budged is what I just described. It takes time for interest rate changes to impact the economy and change labor, the labor situation. But the dynamics are different now. And I think we all realize that the wave of people coming back into the workforce after the pandemic didn't happen. And it's not likely to. And so much of the labor impact that the Fed is looking at is going to be a slowly developing one. And that speaks to the likely duration of the coming downturn. So it's going to take a long time. The other thing we know about labor is when wage rates go up, they never come down. So we're dealing with a higher plateau every time that's ratcheted up. And that's what we have going into now, an economic downturn, which is part of what the Fed is fighting. If wage rates moved a lot up and down based upon what economic factors influence them, it would be easier for the Fed to take action. But what we're seeing now is something quite different. Excuse me, that the actions that the Fed is taking are going to have a very slow impact on labor, which in turn means they're not going to take their foot off the gas unless they blink. And of course, that's a different situation because that brings in the political side of it. Finally, the consequence of all of this is how it affects consumer spending. And what we're obviously seeing is hesitation starting to come in, negative sentiment, declining willingness to spend. All of these things are just sort of front end beginning to show themselves in both the data and in how we are experiencing business ourselves. And we're just underway on that. That's because of all of this delayed reaction. It's going to be, I think, quite a time going through this early part of it. Part of the reason I say that is it's not just the willingness of consumers to spend, which is now declining, it's their actual ability. And yes, inflation is eating into household incomes and household cash, net worth, but there's more to it here. I think what we're seeing is the ability of many consumers is now starting to diminish. And that's going to compound their willingness to spend money. I don't want you to all run for the exits at this point and think the world is coming to an end, because it isn't. I'm merely trying to express the understanding that the downturn that we are entering into may be a longer one and a more drawn out one than I think a lot of pundits and a lot of us as optimistic people that we're hoping for. This looks like it's shaping up to be a longer drawn out one. So as you plan for next year, if you plan for that and it doesn't happen, you're okay. If you don't plan for it and it does happen, that's when much bigger problems are going to occur. I apologize, like hater, I'm just getting over something and my voice is a bit scratchy. And on that point, when consumers sneeze, as the adage goes, small business or businesses generally have a very cautionary reaction to that. That's what we're seeing now. And while there's still a reasonable degree of optimism on the part of businesses generally, this is not just franchising, but just businesses generally in the economy, that's starting to dissipate a bit, and we're starting to see greater shift in in operating expense reductions and even on the labor side. Next slide, please. This is one of the slides that I mentioned is busy, and I'm going to spend a moment on it, but try not to hurriedly take notes. We can share these slides later. I'm going to summarize the economic side of it in the following way. What we do know, we know it's a slowing economy. We know we're going to have rising interest rates for some time to come, and they're going to stay higher. We know there is no white horse on the horizon come riding in to lift the economy up. It's not going to come from the government. It doesn't look like there's any sector of the economy that are poised to really take off, as we've experienced, say, with technology at the beginning of the century with the financial crisis, where the government came in and really pumped things as it did with the pandemic. We're not seeing any of that. So what matters? Well, obviously, the key to everything is the Fed. And the question is whether they blink. And if they do, we may be in for a much more protracted inflationary period. And that has consequences to unit economics and the business model as well. But at this point, it looks like the Fed is committed to pressing hard enough to actually bring inflation down. And finally, what matters is, when does household income kind of stabilize with all of this? The things we don't know, as you can see there, we don't know how long and deep it is, but I do think that there's a much greater chance that this is going to be longer than most of us had hoped or anticipated. And finally, because of that, this is what we think at Fran Data in analyzing this. It's going to force consumers, and already has to some extent, to be much more price conscious. First, because of their ability to spend money has been declining. But secondly, because of their willingness to price shop, it's much greater now. So I think in 2021, where many businesses were able to raise prices at a reasonable amount, I think most of that is going to go away, or at least that flexibility is going to be much harder to realize in 2023. So on the price side, I don't think you're going to see a lot of opportunity in most sectors. Now, of course, some sectors it's very different, but the general view is it's going to take a while. Obviously, the implication to all of this, with rising costs across the board, with rising labor costs and input costs, we're going to have some significant margin erosion, and we'll touch on that on the franchise side. And finally, one thing that I will emphasize at the end, but I'll mention here, change is happening much more rapidly. Business best practices are being looked at much more quickly. Information is flowing and being analyzed in much more rapid fashion. And that means we're entering a period where innovation is going to start popping up a lot, even within the franchise business model. Peter? Turning to the lending side, clearly one of the three legs of franchising, franchisor, franchisee, and we have to have our friendly neighborhood banker riding along with us. If we don't have capital, we're not going to realize much in the way of growth or even current opportunities. And the good news here from the capital standpoint is that the banking sector as a whole is in really good shape. They have the money. The challenge that we're all confronted with now is accessing that. Lenders are looking at the same kind of economic outlook that we are. They're looking at the same problems that came through from the pandemic, what inflation is doing to eroding business margins, and then the potential for an economic downturn that is more significant than most people feel. Consequently, it changes how they look at business lending and how they're adjusting their credit box according to that. The thing I would highlight here, and this is another busy chart that I would encourage you not to try and digest in whole, but if you look at the purple dots in 2022 and 2023. Those that are the things that they're referring to, revenues, margins, change in build out and opening costs, impact on costs when there's delayed openings. All of those things, if you're a franchisor, you have information about, and the lender needs that information. The world is different now, and a key to how the lending community is going to behave is a function of how much information they have to offset the uncertainty that they're seeing in the lending programs that they have in place. Next slide. As I'm pretty sure most of you know, FranData, one of our main activities is providing a credit risk scoring model for the lending community. So we have a good handle on what they look at, what they care about, and how the franchise systems that they're focused on are actually performing. And so if you mix all of that, it comes down to, in our opinion, a couple of key things for access to capital going into 2023. Your lender that you currently have, that you hug and say nice things to, and has had a great performance record with you, they have a different mindset now as they look at an economic downturn. They have their own portfolio to consider, and they have concentration issues oftentimes. How many loans have they made to that franchise system? How many more do they want to make, regardless of how well they've performed, simply because they have a portfolio concentration evaluation done by the credit risk and the risk management folks in the bank. These are not the business development people that are in control now. These are when we get into an economic downturn, the risk management folks take over the bank credit decisions. Secondly, they have sector issues, and that the concentration across sectors may have absolutely nothing to do with you or your performance, but they may determine, well, we have a lot of loans generally in that sector. We don't think that's going to be a very robust sector going into the downturn. We're just going to slow lending down. Those are factors that influence their behavior going into 2023. And part of the way you offset that is simply, you've got to be more transparent, and you've got to find ways, not necessarily through the FDD, which is not your only vehicle for communicating with lenders, but find ways of putting the information together in a way that they understand what happened through the pandemic, what happened during the inflationary spiral that has impacted margins. That's stuff they need to understand now in order to continue lending. So let's turn to franchising. What you're seeing now on the franchising side are a couple of the key things that we are hearing from our franchisor clients, and they're asking us to do research around. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail for you here. Some of the concerns going into a downturn is related to how much growth did they have, let's say in 2021, even in 2019, 2020, where there was, for many brands, a growth in the number of signed but not opened. We are heading into a period where the internal focus from a support standpoint is going to get a greater amount of attention in most franchisors than the focus historically on primarily on growth. Some of the issues that come out of that, for instance, on transfers, we're entering a period of consolidation in many franchise systems where the bigger guys buy the smaller guys. There are implications to that. So the message here is that as you set your goals for next year on the development side, be cognizant of the impact that the pandemic, inflation, and now an economic downturn is having on the underperforming units. Because from a focus standpoint, lenders are laser focused on that behavior. Next slide. One thing I would add that just from a trend standpoint in franchise development, history has shown that in the early stages of any economic downturn, franchise development slows way down. In the latter stages of a recession, franchise development is one of the leading growth vehicles coming out of the recession. And so the question for you, and this varies somewhat by sector, is where do you see that turning? Because in the early stages, there's just not a lot of prospects, and the prospects are more reluctant and more choosy about making any job change when they're at the front end of a downturn. But as we go through that, as we all know, people are dislocated, people change, people are tired of doing what they're doing, and they start to look at other opportunities. So that pattern from where we are at the beginning of a downturn to where that starts to turn is important for you as you set your development goals, because it's going to influence how successful you're going to be. Next slide. So here I'm going to summarize a couple things on this slide, and then suggestions on a couple things that we're hearing from our franchisor clients on things that they're doing in particular. But here are the summary points that I would leave with you on the where we are today and looking kind of into 2023, perhaps well into 2024, and what the potential impediments are to having a good, successful growth period for you. The first one we're seeing is that there's clearly a lot of movement in the offering models and in the changes in operations that came out of the pandemic. We've had franchisor clients, and just anecdotally, asking us to look at different specific functions of operations within their program to look at where are the best practices, where are things, who's doing what, and how successful is it, and what are the consequences of it. We've already talked about consumers and price sensitivity. Just talked about the pool of franchisees, and the timing of when that starts to turn should influence the assumptions that you're making on the growth plans that you have for 2023, certainly in the first half of 2023 and then into 2024. We're going to have tougher lending standards, and that raises a point from your standpoint as you're looking at prospects. Whatever your prospect standards are for things like liquidity, they should be raised, because you can count on the fact that lenders are raising them. And if lenders are raising them and the liquidity isn't there, knowing that it's going to take longer to, in all likelihood, to reach break even to get open. And in the facing a downturn, it's just going to be harder for that franchisee, and a lender will want to see that they have more reserve capacity to do that. Legal impediments, you just heard some of what was just mentioned. And then finally, the stretched working capital. On that, I want to highlight one thing, and that is that we saw a lot of delays on remodels and changes that were introduced, that would have normally been introduced during 20 and even into early 21. And those delays were now starting to come back into play and being enforced by franchisors at a time when we're heading into yet another downturn. And if you look at your array of franchisees, from the ones that are the most strong and in a great position to the weakest ones, wherever that balance is, you need to be cognizant of introducing a lot of financial implications, especially to that weaker group. And that's where I would go back up to the top point of offering models and changing operations, where we're seeing a lot of franchisors that are actually modifying their programs. Next slide. So how are the brands dealing with this? Like the lending community, where we get daily feeds of what they're looking at, what they're concerned about, and how they want us to evaluate brands on their behalf. Franchisors are asking us a lot of research questions, and the pattern of those research questions over time gives us a pretty good insight as to what they're concerned about and where change is happening. on the new model and the remodel, the technology innovation. We're seeing that the cycle for that shortening, so that the changes that are going on, they're actually changing the offering model, as opposed to some of the remodeling changes and so forth. It creates the potential for a bit of a bifurcated franchise system. And that's part of what we're being asked to research, to look at things like that and say, well, how does that play out? What are the consequences of that for a franchise system? So as you look at next year, if you're introducing or planning on introducing a lot of change, knowing that balance between strong and weak franchisees and the implications to them is an important one to consider. Consolidation, I mentioned earlier, whenever we get into a downturn, you see the stronger franchisees acquiring the weaker franchisees, or the franchisor acquiring franchisees. We know there's a lot of PE capital that's more than willing to do to help those bigger franchisees get even bigger. One of the questions that comes out of that, that we've been asked now several times, just relatively recently, is how much concentration is too much? In other words, how much do we want to vest in a smaller concentration of franchisees and franchised units? So a lot of stuff comes out of this that is now changing how we are looking at and thinking about the business model of franchising going forward. Everything that I've said so far may not sound particularly exciting or optimistic as it relates to the US. The only thing I'll mention on international is it's worse over there. So the domestic activity that's going on here is still relatively stronger than just about any other region or country in the world. On the marketing side, changing demographics, changing the type of customer that you're dealing with and how their behaviors are changing is forcing marketing to change dramatically. And finally, on the unit economics, which of course is the core to everything in franchising, what we're seeing there.
Yeah, what is it, the rating?
Rating. Like,
Another R thing. Yeah, R and R. Yeah, she's emailing it up. Yeah.
Somebody might want to mute. Thank you. On the unit economics side, a couple of things that I would reiterate is the price sensitivity doesn't allow much movement. It doesn't appear it will in 2023. Costs, input costs, labor costs, they're all rising. So margins have clearly been squeezed. And the question is, how do you gain efficiencies in that kind of environment? And that's both a conundrum and where much of the creative innovation is going to take place in the next 12 to 18 months. And finally, my comment on lender needs, higher prospect standards, better system transparency, those are all keys. And if I were to leave you with one word with lenders, as it looks at 2023, because they have the same concerns and uncertainty that everybody else in the economy does, it's transparency. If your system is not particularly transparent, I am pretty confident you're going to have a much greater challenge maintaining access to capital. Last slide, please. This is the last slide, and I would end with the following. There is a lot more innovation and fundamental changing happening faster now and will over the course of 2023 and into 2024, so that information sharing, the challenges that everyone's trying to deal with, best practices coming out of that are going to be popping up everywhere. And we see that in our research, we see it in what we hear that from what our clients are saying. So change is sometimes a very good thing. And while this is a very difficult way of bringing about change, it has a greater willingness on the part of everybody in franchising to accept change. And that's one of the opportunities that you should take advantage of. And finally, on the lender side, I will again just highlight the word transparency. That's critical to the capital access side going into a downturn. And one other thing I'll mention just on the cost side for franchisees on the unit economics, rising interest rates means greater interest costs. And that is coming right out of the bottom line. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Grant.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Excellent overview, very sobering, but you also highlight that there are opportunities within this kind of context. You highlighted planning ahead, being transparent with stakeholders, particularly lenders, and just the chance to reimagine, operating expenses and looking for efficiencies. Are there one or two other kind of specific practical tips that you might provide? I know it's a very diverse audience here in terms of franchisors, franchisees, suppliers. But are there one or two additional tips that you might offer up in this kind of environment that, may turn out to be opportunities or at least ways to navigate some choppy waters a little bit better?
I would, I think there are two things that I could highlight. One is that the point that I just ended with on change creates opportunity. No one has the right answer for all of this. No one is certain what's to come. So we're going to have a lot of experimentation going inside the business model. And that experimentation, some things are going to work really well and some things aren't. So that information sharing, the conferences, IFA is kind of a central collection point for it. The kind of best practice analysis that evolves out of experimentation, those are things that I think will lead to a much stronger business model. But it's going to be choppy getting through that because we've got all of these different things floating out there that are going to influence the outcome. However, the other point I'd make is we're all willing to embrace change when we're all struggling. When we're all confronted with a major challenge, it's like, well, if you have a good idea, I guess I'll try it. And I think franchisees, we're certainly hearing that from franchisors, that there is a greater community sense to a lot of this than there used to be. And so I think maybe it takes a crisis to bring people together, but I think it will lead to a much stronger business model as a result of that.
Terrific. So I think the takeaways from that are stay engaged, make sure you're making great use of your data. Franchisors working very closely with their franchisees around these kind of challenges can produce really long-lasting innovation and some opportunities. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. And I know we want to take a look at the midterm elections as well. So I know a number were in the chat bar. Maybe we'll go to one or two of those. And so I think first question up was from Paulina. Paulina, do you want to just verbalize your question?
Sure, yeah, I just wanted to know what your take was on franchises that serve B2B customers, such as services, tax services, technology versus B2C, because it seems like with the FAST Act, with household spending being extremely tight, B2C franchises are looking like they're going to suffer a little bit more, perhaps. But again, I'm not the expert in the room, so I was wondering what your outlook was on B2B franchises.
It's a wonderful question, and unfortunately, I can't give you a thoughtful answer without looking at that in a little more detail. I will note that through every transition, every change that we've encountered, when coming out of the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, it really spawned a fitness industry or fitness franchising in a tremendously explosive way. And so there was, I'm not sure many people saw that coming, but the millennial age group decided that regardless of what the economy was like, they have certain expenditures that they characterized as necessary, and it wasn't discretionary at all. And that included massage and gyms and that sort of thing. So the behavior that came out of that was different than we expected going in. In the pandemic, when we had the behavior there really leaned towards the residential services, because everybody's working from home and they're looking around and thinking, maybe I can upgrade this or fix that or do this. And so there was a lot more growth, and continues to be, in the residential services side. As it relates to just a distinction between B2B and B2C across the board, That's a difficult thing to answer because typically the two examples I just gave you, those are sectors that behave based on economic factors, not just B2B or B2C influences. So I'm unfortunately, I'm not in a good position to be able to answer your question directly, but I'd be happy to follow up with you if you would choose, if you would like to.
Terrific. Great question. Great insights, Daryl. Hopefully we all had some practice in reimagining rapid innovation, over the last few years. Hopefully we can bring back some of those learnings and kind of muscle memory to help navigate the next couple of years. But your insights are really important and really valuable, Daryl. So we really appreciate it very much. And thanks for also being available for follow-up for folks that may have additional questions. Again, thank you so much. And thank you, FranData, for all that you do for franchising. And so with that, let me turn it over to Sam Ballas, Vice Chair of the Franchisor Forum, to introduce the next topic, where we can take a look at the midterm elections, which are coming up very quickly. Sam? And Sam may be having some AV issues, so I'll just chime in. We are really honored to have Erin Covey here. She is from Inside Elections. And so she's going to give us a little bit of a preview. As you can see, her background is on the screen here. Really well positioned to give us some insights. This is an important topic for many reasons, but certainly for franchising as well. And so we appreciate Erin leading us in this discussion. Then we'll have some time for some Q&A right afterwards. Erin, go ahead and take it away. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you again for listening. Excited to chat with y'all about the midterm outlook. Let me go ahead and share my screen so I can pull up these slides. 1 second. All right. All right, I believe this should be good to go then. Yeah, so believe it or not, we are 2 weeks out from the election, which is crazy. It feels like it was 2 years ago yesterday. And so excited to chat with y'all 2 weeks out. So this is probably one of the best times that you could get some analysis. It obviously changes a lot. And in the past couple of months have been particularly tumultuous in terms of some of the outlooks and forecasts that we've been discussing. So I'm excited to break down some of these individual races and just more generally what we're looking at for 2022. So obviously Congress is on the line this year. Both the Senate and the House are at stake. Democrats have very narrow majorities, both in the Senate and the House. The Republicans would only need to flip 1 seat to win control of the Senate and would need to net 5 seats to win control of the House. So from the beginning of this cycle, looking at historical precedent, we were expecting this to be a good year for Republicans. That the outlook for how good this year would be for Republicans has definitely shifted a lot back and forth over the past 2 years. But at this point, it was fairly consistent the whole time that Republicans do still have the advantage. And I'll go ahead and break down more why we believe this, but just to give you that overlook. So these are the 3 most likely scenarios that we're looking at Inside Elections. The most likely we believe is still Republican control of the House and Democratic control of the Senate. So Republicans have always been more favored to take back the House than the Senate. That's due to a couple of factors. One of those is that the Senate map is a little more favorable towards Democrats this year, just because the races that are up are in states that Biden narrowly carried in 2020. And so states like Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, et cetera. These are all states that have the most vulnerable Democratic senators, and they're better positioned to win those states than some other states like West Virginia, Montana, Ohio, where you have Democratic senators who won't be up for re-election till 2024. So even though 2022 is largely should be a good year for Republicans, in terms of the Senate map specifically, 2022 is actually not a bad year for Democrats. And so at this point, we have our range set at a Republican +1 to a Democratic +1 most likely scenario. So obviously right now it's tied. And since President Biden is president, 2 out of 3 of those scenarios would involve Democratic control of the Senate, which is why we do believe that Democrats do have a slight advantage at this point, though that has tightened up, I would say, in the past couple of weeks. which is why the second most likely scenario is not that far behind the first at this point, which would be Republicans sweeping both chambers of Congress. And then the third most likely scenario, a lot less likely than the other two, but we're still putting it up there, would be Democratic expansion. So Democrats would be able to hold on to their slim majorities in the Senate and the House. All right, so looking at midterm results, one of the main factors that we look at when we're forecasting what the results are going to be is the presidential approval. So as you can see right here, it has vacillated quite a bit over the past 2 years. So President Biden's approval first started going down back in August of last year, largely sparked through the withdrawal of Afghanistan and how that was handled. And then it kind of continued on that downward trajectory as inflation got worse, gas prices continued to rise. And it was pretty much on a downward trajectory until this summer. And there were a couple of pretty dramatic shifts in like the national political environment that contributed to his approval going back up again. Some of that was increased Democratic motivation among base voters in reaction to the overturning of Roe v. Wade and how that could impact various states' laws on abortion. You saw a lot of Democratic overperformance in some special elections over the summer that made Democrats more optimistic. And then you also saw a couple of domestic successes for President Biden that were able to come through over the summer that included the Inflation Reduction Act, the gun control bill, even student loan forgiveness. These are all issues that invigorated the Democratic base voters, and as a result caused his approval to go back up among them, which lifted his approval on the whole. His approval is still obviously very low among Republicans and then independent voters as well, but it has gone back up with Democratic voters, which has contributed to this bump here that we saw in July. But then for the past month and a half or so, it's held pretty steady. And at this point, it's unlikely that anything would change that in 2 weeks leading up to November. Of course, a lot of voters have already cast their ballots with the rise of mail-in voting. A lot of voters received their ballots weeks ago and started casting their ballots weeks ago. So we're not looking at any significant changes most likely, but you never know, never say never. And then you'll see here, I'm going to go ahead and start with the fight for the Senate. I'm going to go into a little more detail on these Senate races because they are a little higher profile, obviously, and will be the outcomes of these individual races will be a lot more influential on who controls the Senate. But if anyone has any specific questions about any of these races, happy to take questions afterward. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because I don't want to spend too much time and get too bogged down in details, but I'll go ahead and give you an overview of the most competitive Senate races that we are watching right now. So as you can see, the midterm trend for Senate races is that the party in power typically loses seats in the election following presidential election. And so there have been a couple of exceptions to that rule. A lot of these have occurred during pretty earth-shattering events in America's history. So in 1934, that would have been the Great Depression. The Democratic Party picked up seats in both the House and the Senate. That was during FDR's term. And then in 2002, we had, following 9/11, Republicans made gains in both the House and the Senate. So a lot of these exceptions have happened during some dramatic events that have had a significant impact on the political environment. Now, there have been scenarios where even though the environment might have been bad for one party, they were still able to make gains in the Senate, just because unlike the House, the Senate is a little less tied to the winds of the national environment. Some of that is due to, like I said earlier, structural advantages, which Senate seats are specifically up for re-election, but it also has to do with candidate quality. For a lot of these statewide races, for governor, Senate mostly, voters care a lot more about, or paying a lot more attention to the individual candidates, more so than they are with the House races. And so while voters are much more likely to just kind of vote down the party line when it comes to the down ballot races, including House races, with Senate races, there's a little more aberration with that. So for example, in 2018, because of the way the map was structured and the candidates that were running, Republicans actually picked up seats in the Senate. Obviously, 2018 is thought of as a blue wave year, which it definitely was in the House, but that was not the case in the Senate. So that's just a little reminder that the Senate doesn't always follow the winds when it comes to the political environment. Big picture. Currently, there are 35 seats up for re-election in the Senate this year. Typically, there would have been 34, but we have a special election in Oklahoma, which is why it's 35. 12 of these races are currently rated solid, likely, lean, or tilting Democratic. And then 20 of these races are currently rated solid, likely, lean, or tilting Republican. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that Republicans have an inherent advantage. It just means that Republicans have more seats up for re-election this year. So Democrats have 36 seats that they control that are not up for re-election, and Republicans have 29 seats that are not up for re-election. And then at this point, we have 3 seats, which I'll go into further detail in a few moments, that are rated as pure toss-ups in our view, and that is Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada. And so, like I said earlier, our current projection is Republican +1 to a Democratic +1, and then 2 out of 3 of those scenarios would result in Democratic control thanks to Harris's tie-breaking vote. So this is kind of across the board where we see all of these races. I'm not going to go into detail on any of the solid races, since those will probably have fairly predictable outcomes. But at this point, like I said, we have 3 races in toss-up, and then we have in New Hampshire and Arizona, the 2 Democratic senators in those races. These are both very competitive races and obviously swing states, New Hampshire and Arizona. But in both cases, you've seen the Democratic senators fairly consistently lead the Republican nominees in polling. And then on the tilty side, we have North Carolina, which is an open seat. The Republican Senator Richard Burr is retiring. And then we also have Ron Johnson, who is probably the most vulnerable Republican senator. In the middle, the 2 most vulnerable Democratic senators are Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada and Raphael Warnock in Georgia. And then in Pennsylvania, we have another Republican-held open seat because Senator Pat Toomey is retiring. So we'll start with Arizona. So Senator Mark Kelly, who won the special election in 2020, is up for re-election again, and he beat the Republican Senator Martha McSally by 2 points in 2020. So this was quite a close race, closer than folks were expecting. And this year he's facing Blake Masters, who is a venture capitalist. He won a pretty divided Republican primary with 40% of the vote, thanks in large part to the financial backing of Peter Thiel, who invested heavily in his candidacy during the primary. In Georgia, we have this rated as a toss-up. This is one of the most interesting races to watch right now, not just because of all the news about the specific candidates, particularly Herschel Walker, but because there's a very good chance that this race is going to go to a runoff, which is what happened in 2020. This year, Georgia changed their election laws, so the runoff would be in December instead of January, so it would be a much tighter turnaround. And it's pretty unclear at this point who a runoff would benefit, whether it would be better for Republicans or for Democrats. But what is clear, and what most strategists agree on both sides of the aisle, is that the most likely scenario at this point is a runoff. Neither candidate is hitting 50% in a lot of polls. It has shown a very tight race, and since there is a third-party candidate on the ballot, it's pretty likely that Warnock and Walker will face each other again in December. So in Nevada, if I had to pick between Nevada and Georgia, I would say that the Democratic senator in Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto, is probably slightly more vulnerable than Raphael Warnock. This is an interesting state because it is largely flown under the radar just because the 2 candidates haven't made the same types of headlines that the candidates in some of these other Senate races have. And so this is probably the best test of a fairly generic Democratic senator running against a fairly generic Republican nominee. Catherine Cortez Masto beat Joe Heck just by 2 points in 2016. And in Nevada, there are also a couple of third-party candidates running. Nevada also has a unique option on its ballot for voters to select none of the above. So they can positively basically vote for no one in a race, which obviously in more safe seats, this would not have a significant impact on the outcome. But in a race as tight as this one is shaping up to be, that could have a significant impact. So I always like to remind people that if you're looking at polls of the Nevada Senate race specifically, or any of the Nevada races really, but specifically with the Senate race, always check to see if they are polling the none of the above question as well, because if you're looking at full ballot results, that could definitely impact the outcome. So Catherine Cortez Masto is facing Adam Laxalt, who is a former state attorney general. And he didn't have a contentious primary as opposed to some of these other Republican nominees in other states. And he won with 56% of the votes. This is another state that's going to be really key in looking at where the Latino vote is swinging. Obviously, Republicans have made significant gains with Latino voters since 2020. And there's been a lot of attention on districts in South Texas and South Florida, where there have been like more dramatic shifts towards Republicans. But obviously, Latino voters are not a monolith, and there's a lot of diversity within that, particularly state to state. So it'll be interesting to see in a state like Nevada how they shift the outcome of this race. New Hampshire. So Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan is also up for re-election. Again, this is another purple state, but one that Democrats have a built-in advantage that they don't have in places like Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. So Maggie Hassan is up for re-election, and this is a race that a lot of folks thought would be more competitive because Republicans were trying really hard to recruit the governor, who is a Republican, Chris Sununu, very popular, to run for Senate. He ended up declining, and that kind of made this less of a competitive race than it would have been otherwise. In fact, we just saw one of the main Republican outside groups just pulled a bunch of money from New Hampshire and started spending it in Pennsylvania instead, which is always kind of a good look at like where folks think the outlook is going to be. If you pay attention to those spending decisions, you'll be able to see, okay, this race is probably not going to be as competitive as a race like Pennsylvania. So in New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan is facing Don Bolduc, who is a retired brigadier general. He won the primary with only 37% of the vote, just by 1 point over Chuck Morse, who is the state Senate minority leader. And this was a very contentious primary. It was also very late in the game. New Hampshire's primary was not until mid-September this year. And anytime you have a late primary, that usually benefits the incumbents in this situation, just because they're able to save their resources and maintain a more positive image, whereas the candidates in the primary faced obviously a barrage of attack ads and that sort of thing that will end up being extra baggage in the general election as well. So Colorado, this is kind of a reach pickup opportunity for Republicans this year. We have this rated as likely Democratic. Michael Bennet is definitely favored to win here still. Colorado used to be more purple, but has definitely trended more towards Democrats in the past decade. But Republicans are really excited about their nominee in this state, construction company CEO Joe O'Dea. And so while maybe at some point earlier in the cycle, like 6 months ago, when folks were thinking that Republicans might have a really good year this year, this was one of those states that could have been like a sleeper pickup opportunity for Republicans. But I think at this point in the cycle now, most strategists on both sides of the party agree that Bennett is certainly favored here, and it would be a big surprise if O'Dea won. But the polls have been close enough and it's competitive enough that this is worth a likely Democratic rating. There's a similar situation in Washington, another pretty blue state, where Patty Murray is up for re-election. She's facing a Republican nominee, triage nurse Tiffany Smiley, another strong Republican candidate who could win in a really good year for Republicans, but probably not looking at a super strong red wave scenario. In Pennsylvania, this is obviously one of the highest profile races due to the candidates involved. So the incumbent Senator Pat Toomey is not seeking re-election, and Republicans have nominated Dr. Oz, the celebrity talk show host, to be their nominee. He won a very contentious primary with only 31% of the vote. A lot of that was largely due to a bump that he got from Trump's endorsement towards the end. And then he's facing Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, who is a Democratic nominee. Wisconsin, Senator Ron Johnson is probably the most vulnerable Republican up for re-election this year. Wisconsin is a very purple state, and Johnson's favorability has been pretty low even among Republican voters. However, he's led the polls against the Democratic nominee, Mandela Barnes, pretty consistently. Mandela Barnes is a little more on the progressive side, and Republicans have been able to hammer him with a lot of pretty effective attack ads, and so Mandela Barnes's favorabilities have also gone down. They're not as low as Johnson's at this point, but Johnson still has the advantage. He has a bit of a built-in advantage because he's an incumbent as well. And then in North Carolina, this is another interesting state. We recently moved this from lean Republican to tilt Republican, which means it's moving in favor of Democrats. The incumbent there, Richard Burr, is not seeking re-election. Polls have shown this is a very tight race right now between Republican Congressman Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley, who is a former state Supreme Court justice. North Carolina definitely, while it is a purple state, does tend to benefit Republicans more. Democrats haven't won a Senate race here since 2008. And so a lot of Democrats are still kind of wary of their chances of picking up this seat, particularly in a year like 2022, which Republicans are still favored. However, Beasley has been a really strong fundraiser and has been able to make this more of a competitive race than folks would have thought otherwise. And then in Florida, another swing state that has trended more Republican in recent years. Marco Rubio is up for re-election, and so is the governor, Ron DeSantis. Both of them have polled consistently above their Democratic opponents for the past month, and both are strongly favored to win. And then Ohio, this is another interesting race. We have this one at lean Republican. Ohio is also a state that used to be more competitive, but is pretty solidly Republican now. Trump won it by 10 points in 2020. The incumbent, Senator Rob Portman, decided not to seek re-election. And so Republicans nominated J.D. Vance, who is the author of Hillbilly Elegy, y'all may have heard of. And the Democratic nominee is Representative Tim Ryan. This race has also been closer than a lot of folks were expecting. Recent polls have shown that Vance is leading by a couple of points, but I think most folks expected this to be the kind of race where the Republican would be leading at least by the high single digits by now. And so the fact that it's still kind of within the margin of error of a lot of polls is pretty surprising. And so this could be a potential pickup opportunity for Democrats. But again, in a state like Ohio and in a year like 2022, there's not a great chance of that happening. But just because it has been so close, we have this in the lean Republican category. And then in Utah, this is kind of a unique scenario. The Republican Senator Mike Lee is up for re-election, and he's facing Evan McMullen, who is running as an independent. The Democratic Party in Utah has not fielded their own candidate and has endorsed McMullen instead. And McMullen already has a reputation as a anti-Trump voice. Obviously, he ran against Trump in the 2016 election. And even though Utah is a very conservative state, it's also pretty anti-Trump. And so he's hoping to kind of build a coalition of independent and Democratic and some Republican voters. But Lee still certainly has the advantage here. And then Iowa, this is another state that used to be more purple, but is trended more Republican in recent years. Chuck Grassley is up for re-election, and this should not be maybe as competitive as it is. We had this one in solid Republican for a while, but there were a couple of polls that came out, including one by one of the most respected Iowa pollsters, Ann Stelzer, that showed this was a tighter race than folks were expecting. And then on the congressional level, we've seen some closer races as well. And so I think the reason that this is maybe shaping up to be a little closer than folks expected seems to be due to Grassley's age and some voters just wanting someone new. But we still expect Grassley to win here, and this is still certainly a state that favors Republicans and has been moving away from Democrats for a while. All right, and then the fight for the House. Obviously, I'm not going to go into detail on these individual districts as much as I did with the Senate races, just because that would take way too much time, but I'll go ahead and try to give some big picture outlooks for what we're looking at and the factors that are going into our forecast here. So just like Senate races, typically the party that's not in power tends to lose seats in the midterm elections. This is a stronger role in House races than Senate races, where, like I said earlier, there are some outside factors that make it easier for Senate races to kind of defy whatever the political environment is at the time. But in terms of House races, the president's party has almost always lost races, and you'll see the only exceptions to that have been in 1934 during the Great Depression, 1998, which was following Bill Clinton's impeachment, and then 2002 following 9/11. So the generic ballot is an interesting test of where the political environment is. This is a totally hypothetical scenario. Basically is a national poll asking voters if they would prefer to have a Republican or a Democrat represent them in Congress. So obviously this is not something that is going to reflect a specific race, but it is kind of like President Biden's approval, a good test of where the national mood is at the moment. So typically Democrats do have an advantage on the generic ballot because they have an advantage in the popular vote in America. And so you'll see here this graph that we have from Crystal Ball, typically like a 5% lead with Democrats on the generic ballot will correspond with them actually losing seats in the House and gaining maybe a few Senate seats on average. So you'll see for this cycle, Republicans did take the lead on the generic ballot last fall, which was pretty unusual. Again, typically Democrats lead the generic ballot. In 2020, there was obviously several Republicans picked up seats in the House.
Alexa, play soft pop music.
However, Democrats did lead the generic ballot the entire time in 2020. Now, as you'll see, Democrats took the lead back again over the summer following the reversal of Roe v. Wade and kind of a boost in Democratic motivation at that point. But since then, Republicans have actually taken the lead back again. As of a few days ago, Republicans now very narrowly lead the generic ballot on average, according to 538, which is where this graph is from. So House retirements are kind of another way that we look at which party is more forecasted to benefit from the midterm elections. So typically the party in power the party that is in power that is expected to lose power, you'll see more retirements in. And so on the Democratic side, we saw 32 House Democrats retire or decide to seek election to a different office. Obviously, being the party out of power is much less fun than being the party in power. And so a lot of times you'll see a lot of retirements in anticipation of that. And then we had 19 House Republicans retire or seek election to a different office. Redistricting was another wrinkle in the process this year. It's all wrapped up right now, so I'm not going to go into super long detail about that. But basically the consensus, as you all know, happens every 10 years, and that determines how states decide to draw their lines, both for the congressional districts, but also for local districts as well, and state House and state Senate districts. And so typically the state legislatures would have controlled this process. And so whatever party controls the state legislature typically has control of the redistricting process. This year we saw independent commissions at work for the first time. And so that was an interesting test of how that would work as opposed to the typical partisan controlled process. It had mixed success. You had some states where the independent commission basically was a stalemate and the courts ended up taking over the process. But you did have some states where they were successful in drawing up what should have been a more fair and less partisan map. And then you'll also see here, obviously the states that have experienced population growth over the past 10 years gained seats, and the states that lost population tended to lose seats. So most of those gains were in places in the Sun Belt, like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, all gained congressional seats. Also out west in Colorado, Montana, and Oregon, there were some gains. And then the states that lost districts were mostly concentrated in the Rust Belt area, places like Iowa, Illinois, and Michigan. The big picture with the House, we currently have 205 races that are rated as solid, likely, lean, or tilting Democratic, and we have 212 races that are rated as solid, likely, lean, or tilting Republican. And then we have 18 races rated as the pure toss-up. So you'll see just some quick math. Each party would need 218 seats for a majority. And so if, in theory, if Republicans win all of the seats that we think they're favored to win, so that would be 212 races, they would only need to win 6 of those toss-up races in addition to that in order to have a majority, which is why we do believe that Republicans are most likely to net at least 8 seats. They'll probably be towards the upper end of that at this point. We recently changed our range from 8 to 20 to 8 to 25, just kind of showing how in the last couple of weeks, polls have shown that Republicans are doing better in some districts, particularly in bluer states like Oregon and New York. And so right now at this point, obviously, generally we expect toss-ups to swing one way or the other. They typically don't just like split down the middle. And so if Democrats were able to win all of the toss-ups, they could keep the majority. And this is where we have all of our house races. We don't have the solid categories on there, but all of our likely, lean, tilt, and toss-up races. So without going into too much detail, again, just a couple of big picture takeaways from this. You'll see in the likely R category, we have several blue seats, and a lot of that is mostly due to the fact that states like Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee were able to draw congressional maps that were more favorable to Republicans. And so a lot of these blue seats that are here are flipping, not necessarily because of the candidates themselves, but because the district is a lot safer for Republicans rather than Democrats now. And that's the case in some of these lean R and tilt R seats as well. And then governor's races. Governors are often overlooked in the DC media ecosphere. And so I want to give like a quick outlook for where we see these governor's races picking up. But right now, even more so than in the Senate, this is probably some of Democrats' best midterm opportunities are in the governor's races. They have 2 races in Massachusetts and Maryland that they are quite likely to win. These are both blue states that currently have Republican governors who are retiring. And so that's Charlie Baker in Massachusetts and Larry Hogan in Maryland. And Democrats are strongly favored to win both of those races. And then there's also Arizona, where the Republican governor is also retiring, Doug Ducey. And Democrats have a pretty strong chance of, well, not a strong chance, but they have a shot at flipping that one as well. Though this one is going to be a lot tighter, obviously, than the Massachusetts and Maryland races. And then Democrats' most vulnerable incumbents are in Nevada, Kansas, Wisconsin, and Oregon. Oregon is kind of an interesting case because this is a test of how much an independent candidate is going to sway the results. There is a former Democratic state legislature who's running for governor there as well. And she's been polling in the double digits and has been able to draw enough support away from the Republican and Democratic nominees that this is more competitive for Democrats than they would like, which is why we have a state like Oregon as a toss-up right now in the governor's race. All right, well, I can go ahead and take questions about any specific races or just the national environment in general, but if anyone has any further questions, feel free to email me afterward. I can be reached at erin@insideelections.com, and I'm on Twitter at ERCubby. But thank you again for listening.
Erin, thank you. Terrific overview, very helpful, and appreciate you adding in the governor's races perspective as well. So thank you. I guess I'll just start off with a question, and I think we may have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So please put that in the chat bar or raise your hand, folks, and then we'll have a chance to come to you in just a minute. But let me just start off with a question. Erin, you know, in the last couple election cycles, we've seen that sometimes the polls kind of poll one way, and then there's kind of a surprise on election day. And so I guess my question for you is, what are the chances that you think there may be a surprise in either direction, you know, overall? Like, how accurate do you think the polling is right now, just given how dynamic the world is?
That's a good question. So it kind of varies. Obviously, in 2016 and 2020 specifically, polls did underestimate Republican voters, and a lot of that was due to Trump specifically as a candidate. And so it's kind of hard to predict how 2022 is going to pan out as a result. 2018, the polls were actually a little more accurate, and a lot of folks forget that and focus more on the 2016 and 2020 misses. But I think, you know, you've definitely seen pollsters change some of their methods and change the way that they conduct these polls in order to like account for the errors in 2016 and 2020. But I think whenever as a consumer you're reading polls, I would say the most important thing to always do is just look at it in the context of all the other polls you've seen so far. And before you get too excited about one poll that maybe shows like a better outcome than you hope for, look at it in the context of where the average is. 538 and Real Clear Politics do a good job of tracking all the polls and putting them into an average. And if it's pretty far outside of that average, there's a good chance it's an outlier. And before deciding like, okay, maybe this is going to significantly impact the race, look and see, wait until there's a couple more polls and see if it's actually a trend or not. But I do think another thing I like to remind folks of is that places like Inside Elections and also like Political Report and Crystal Ball, we're not just looking at the public polling, we're also looking at private polling that's conducted by a lot of the campaigns and super PACs themselves. And a lot of times, obviously, those polls are partisan. And so you have to take them with a grain of salt because of that. But they also can be more accurate in a lot of situations because the folks who are doing polls for campaigns and PACs have a stronger incentive to get it right because people are making spending decisions based on those polling results. And so even though they are partisan, sometimes they can be more accurate than the media polls.
Excellent. Very helpful. Very helpful. I asked you already my second question, which is, do you plan to vote? And you confirmed the answer is yes. So being in the business, I assume that was the case. So very good. I think we may have time for one or two more questions. If anybody wants to put their hand up, just a question for Aaron. As a reminder, IFA is a nonpartisan organization, but very pro-franchising. So FranPAC supports candidates on both sides of the aisle, and particularly candidates that work across the aisle. So just as a reminder on that public service announcement. I don't see any more questions at this point. Very good. We may need to have you back right after the election to just kind of interpret what happened. So we'll see. But this is coming up soon, just a few weeks, and already happening, as you noted, with mail-in voting. So Aaron, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. We know the next few weeks are going to be busy. I imagine you and like all of your colleagues kind of stay up all night and just sort of watch everything until it all comes in sometime in the early morning. Is that a true statement?
Unfortunately, yes. Though we're anticipating there are definitely quite a few close races in states that take a little longer to count their ballots. So it could be a couple of days, even weeks. I mentioned this with the Georgia race specifically, but there is a decent chance that control of the Senate could come down to the Georgia runoff again. And so if that happens, then we're not going to know who controls the Senate until after December 6th.
Right. Great point. Great point. Great information. Aaron, thank you so much. I think that context is just really helpful in all three cases and just overall. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today. We really, really appreciate it. And so on behalf of everyone here and everyone listening to the recording, again, thank you. And we hope to have a chance to connect again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Excellent. Excellent. So for all those listening live or listening to the recording, I just want to remind you that Thursday, December 8th at 4 o'clock, that's going to be for franchisors. That's the Franchisor Forum. We know that folks that are a part of the Supplier Forum have a separate set of meetings, and folks that are part of the Franchisee Forum have a separate set of meetings. So for those that are franchisors, the next franchisor focused meeting will be on December 8th at 4 o'clock Eastern. There, we're going to have a chance to hear from Sam Ballas, Vice Chair of the Franchisor Forum. He's done a lot of great thinking about how we structure the Franchisor Forum moving forward so that we have the maximum positive impact that we can have on franchising. And so really encourage all franchisors to bring other franchisor teammates to that December 8th at 4 o'clock. There will be an invite going out, I think, from Hayter maybe right after this session. So be on the lookout for that. And please do reserve that time. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, if you want to be involved in supporting franchising, all of us, whether you're a supplier, franchisee, franchisor, can play an important role by being part of the Franchise Action Network. So all you have to do is take out your phone and text FAN to 52886. And you can get brought into that community of franchisee suppliers and franchisors that are really helping legislators understand why franchising is important to the economic development and to job creation across the country. So please do stay engaged. And as a reminder, not too far off, in fact, coming up very soon, IFA's hallmark event, the IFA annual convention, is coming up just in February, and that's going to be in Las Vegas. And as I always say to everyone I have a chance to meet, and this is not a paid endorsement, but just how I really feel about it. If you're going to make 2 events a year, make your own brand's convention for sure, but also then make IFA's annual convention, because you have a chance to connect with many other colleagues across franchising, and the learning and leadership development, not only for each of you, but for your colleagues, others that are a part of your brand, is terrific. So really encourage folks to go ahead and register early and save. It is a great event every single year, and it keeps getting bigger and better every single year. So hope to see all of you at IFA's 2023 annual convention. Next slide. And so with that, thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. This has been a great collaboration, again, of the Supplier Forum, the Franchisee Forum, and the Franchisor Forum. We hope to do more sessions like this in the future. As always, thanks to IFA for what they do for franchising. Thank you also to our guests today, both Daryl Johnson and Aaron Covey, for joining. We look forward to having a chance to continue to stay in touch with both of them. And we wish you all a terrific week. Take care. Thanks for being a part of today's session, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.